Most people who hear the name Strait of Hormuz picture only one thing: a narrow, nervous corridor of water where a fifth of the planet's oil supply squeezes past under the gaze of naval fleets, where a single miscalculation could send shockwaves through every stock exchange on Earth, and where the news only ever seems to arrive wrapped in warnings about tankers, sanctions, and warships lurking just out of sight. That version of the story is real, but it is also incomplete, because long before this stretch of sea became a symbol of global anxiety, it was simply a place where people were born, grew old, and built entire ways of life around one of the harshest environments on the planet. And if you look past the sirens and the shipping charts, you find a world that is stranger, older, and far more resilient than the headlines ever let on. To understand Hormuz, you first have to understand what the water itself demands, because this is not a gentle sea. Summer temperatures here can climb past 95 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to kill coral reefs almost anywhere else on the planet, bleaching them into brittle white graveyards within weeks. Yet the reefs scattered through these shallow, sun-scorched waters have done something remarkable. Over countless generations, they have essentially rewritten their own biology, evolving a tolerance for heat that ought to be lethal, clinging to life while entire reef systems elsewhere in the world quietly die out. These aren't just isolated patches of coral either. They form the backbone of an entire underwater ecosystem, sheltering hundreds of fish species that dart like flickers of light through the murky, current-churned water, and wherever those fish gather, people have always followed. Even today, traditional wooden fishing boats, some built using methods passed down for generations, slip out at dawn to cast their nets, tiny and fragile against the horizon, threading their way between hulking oil tankers that dwarf them in size and mass. For the fishermen who make this crossing daily, survival isn't a metaphor. It's a literal skill. Reading the currents, judging the distance to a supertanker's wake, timing a net's cast around a shipping lane, all while remaining almost entirely invisible to the satellite feeds and market analysts tracking the oil moving above their heads. It's easy to forget, watching footage of naval convoys, that this is also simply someone's workplace, someone's inherited trade, someone's only way of putting food on the table. From these open waters, the strait narrows toward one of its most contested points, the tiny island of Abu Musa, a speck of land barely 5 square miles in size, yet claimed by both Iran and the United Arab Emirates since the early 1970s, and consequently turned into one of the most heavily fortified pieces of ground anywhere on Earth, bristling with radar installations and missile batteries scanning the horizon around the clock. And yet, extraordinarily, ordinary life continues on Abu Musa almost as if none of that existed. Children still walk to school with backpacks slung over their shoulders. Fishermen still sit mending torn nets in the shade. Families still gather for evening tea. All of it unfolding in the long shadow of military hardware that most of them have simply learned to live alongside. There's an unexpected twist buried in this tension too, because the very restrictions that keep outsiders away from Abu Musa, restrictions imposed for security reasons, have inadvertently protected its coastline from the industrial development transforming much of the rest of the Gulf. Reefs here remain largely untouched. Rare seabirds nest without disturbance. And in a strange irony, a militarized zone has become one of the region's last accidental sanctuaries. Continuing outward toward the strait's narrowest throat, you reach the island of Larak, a rugged outcrop where the world's merchant shipping is squeezed into its tightest passage. By daylight, Larak offers a front row seat to the sheer scale of global commerce grinding past, but after dark the island transforms entirely, its shoreline glowing with a strange electric blue shimmer as bioluminescent plankton light up with every breaking wave, a fragile, beautiful phenomenon growing rarer with every passing oil spill. What makes Larak truly remarkable, though, isn't the glow of the water but the voices of the roughly 2,000 people who still live there, many of them speaking Kamsari, an unusual and endangered language that blends threads of Persian, Arabic, Portuguese, and English into something entirely its own, a linguistic fingerprint left behind by centuries of traders, sailors, and colonizers who passed through or settled on this remote rock. Physical traces of that history remain too, most visibly in the crumbling remains of a 16th-century Portuguese fort built from red mud and coral stone, its cannons long silent, its walls slowly dissolving under salt spray and time, a quiet monument to the fact that even the most ambitious empires eventually erode into the landscape, while the people who actually belong to that landscape simply carry on. From Larak, crossing the strait's narrowest gap brings you to a completely different kind of terrain. The Musindum Peninsula, sometimes nicknamed the Norway of the Middle East for its plunging limestone cliffs and deep, drowned valleys that resemble fjords, though these formations owe nothing to glacial carving and everything to millions of years of violent tectonic collision. The isolation created by this vertical, broken landscape is so extreme that, for centuries, the only practical way in or out was by sea. And within that isolation, the Shiha people carved out an existence directly from bare rock, developing a seasonal rhythm of migration to escape the punishing coastal heat by retreating to cooler mountain elevations for part of the year. Before making that seasonal move, they would seal away their most valuable resources, grain and water, inside ingenious partially underground stone vaults known as Beit Alquifal, or House of Locks, a form of architecture built entirely around the logic of scarcity and survival. Hidden deep within these fjords is Telegraph Island, where the British Empire once attempted, in the 19th century, to run a communication line connecting London to Karachi, an endeavor undone by the crushing heat and isolation, conditions so punishing that they reportedly broke the mental health of soldiers stationed there, an unsettling reminder of just how absolute this environment's dominance over human ambition can be. In contrast to the bristling military presence found elsewhere along the strait's shores, the Omani port of Kaseb on the Musindum side represents an entirely different philosophy, a posture of quiet observation rather than aggression, functioning almost as a stabilizing anchor for the region's fragile diplomatic balance, where the towering, silent mountains themselves seem to enforce a kind of restraint that no treaty could guarantee. Crossing back toward the Iranian mainland brings the story to Bandar Abbas, a city that has been built and rebuilt in layers by centuries of trade winds and ocean currents. Once known by a different name before Shah Abbas I reclaimed the port from Portuguese control in the 17th century. The city grew wealthy and complicated through centuries of spice trading, intertwined with the darker history of the slave trade, a legacy that left behind a rich, blended Afro-Iranian community along this coastline, where Persian, Arab, Indian, and African cultural threads didn't simply coexist, but wove themselves together into the everyday fabric of the port. In a place where extreme heat and disease have always tested the limits of physical endurance, the people of Bandar Abbas developed ways of caring for the mind as well as the body, most notably through the Zar ritual, a practice rooted in the belief that unexplained suffering or illness stems from the presence of restless spirits or harmful winds. Rather than treating this as something to be violently exorcised, practitioners use hypnotic, rhythmic African-influenced drumming and thick clouds of incense to gently negotiate with the spirit, coaxing it toward a peaceful coexistence with the afflicted person, a strikingly gentle, community-centered approach to psychological healing built on acceptance rather than confrontation. That same instinct toward coexistence shows up in the city's architecture as well, most strikingly in the Bandar Abbas Hindu temple, with its distinctive tiered, conical roofline standing out sharply against the surrounding Islamic domes, built by Indian merchants in the late 19th century, and still standing today as a quiet reminder of an era when shared economic survival mattered more than strict religious boundaries. In Bandar Abbas, in other words, The most meaningful borders were never the ones drawn on official maps, but the ones dissolved through generations of shared hardship and mutual dependence. Leaving the mainland behind and heading back out to sea brings the journey to Hormuz Island, a place that seems to defy ordinary geology altogether. Rather than forming gradually from sediment like most coastlines, Hormuz Island is essentially a massive salt dome that was violently thrust upward from deep within the Earth's crust, creating a surreal landscape painted in the colors of more than 70 different minerals, streaks of purple, yellow, and silver running through the hills. But the island's most unmistakable feature is its deep red soil, saturated with iron oxide and known locally as shellac, staining entire stretches of shoreline the color of dried blood against the surrounding turquoise sea. Beneath that mesmerizing surface lies a brutal practical reality, though. Freshwater is almost non-existent here, and the soil itself is heavy with salt and minerals, seemingly engineered by nature to make human life nearly impossible. And yet the islanders didn't fight this environment so much as absorb it directly into their way of life, most visibly in the striking domed structures of the Majera residence, whose rounded red earth forms rise from the landscape like an architectural echo of the terrain itself. That same spirit of adaptation extends into the kitchen, in a tradition found almost nowhere else on Earth. Locals harvest the red shellac soil, purify it through a careful process, and use it as an actual culinary ingredient, mixing it with fish and baking it into a traditional flatbread dish known as suraj. In the most literal sense possible, the people of Hormuz Island don't just survive on this harsh red rock, they consume it, transforming the very geology that makes their home so inhospitable into nourishment and identity. From the red dust of Hormuz Island, the waters open up toward Keshem, the largest island in the entire Persian Gulf, and in many ways, an open-air museum of erosion, endurance, and deep geological time. Within its haunting Valley of the Stars, wind and flash floods have spent millennia hollowing out the terrain into jagged, otherworldly formations, while far below the surface, the Namakton Salt Cave stretches for more than 4 miles, an eerily frozen underground river of salt that carries within it the geological memory of ancient oceans rising and retreating. This is a landscape that seems to be perpetually destroying and rebuilding itself, one that by all logic should offer no real foothold for sustained life. And yet at the island's edges, dense stands of Hara mangrove forest manage to survive fully submerged in hypersaline water through sheer biological stubbornness, filtering out salt at a cellular level so they can draw usable freshwater into their root systems. Generations of Keshem's residents have built their own survival around this same resilience, rowing small boats deep into the tangled maze of mangrove roots to harvest leaves that, in a place with essentially no natural pasture land, become critical feed for goats and camels, tying the survival of entire families directly to the endurance of these salt-tolerant trees. Perhaps the most striking human response to this unforgiving terrain, though, is carved directly into the stone of Chaku Canyon, where narrow, deeply eroded corridors wind through rock in patterns that feel almost anatomical, like walking through the exposed structure of the earth itself. Long ago, the people living here studied the natural fault lines and fractures running through the limestone with enough precision to anticipate the rare but violent storms that occasionally strike the island, and using nothing more than hand tools, they carved out an intricate network of wells and water channels directly into the canyon floor, designed purely to capture and store every possible drop of rainfall against the long stretches of drought that otherwise define life here. These aren't grand monuments built to honor kings or gods. They're quiet, practical proof that even in the harshest possible conditions, human beings don't simply wait passively for disaster. They find ways to carve hope directly out of solid stone. Taken together, these places, the radar-scanned beaches of Abu Musa, the towering fjords of Musendam, the rhythmic healing traditions of Bandar Abbas, the salt-stained soil of Hormuz Island, and the ancient waterless canyons of Keshem tell a very different story than the one usually attached to this stretch of water. The world tends to insist that the real danger of the Strait of Hormuz lies entirely in politics. Fragile shipping lanes, the constant threat of blockade, the ever-present possibility of military escalation. But spend enough time looking at the people who actually call this place home, and it becomes clear that their oldest and most persistent adversary has never really been geopolitics at all. It has been nature itself. The punishing heat, the barren rock, the near-total absence of fresh water. And in the face of all of that, generation after generation of people here have done far more than simply endure. They have built entire architectural traditions out of colored earth, developed rituals to heal the mind alongside the body, preserved languages found nowhere else on the planet, and shaped vibrant, distinct communities out of some of the most extreme conditions imaginable. The Strait of Hormuz will likely keep making headlines as an energy chokepoint and a geopolitical pressure point for as long as global trade depends on oil moving through it. But underneath that familiar narrative sits a much older, quieter, and ultimately more remarkable story, a living testament to human endurance and a steady, understated reminder that even in one of the most dangerous and demanding corners of the planet, life consistently finds a way not just to persist, but to do so with a strange, unmistakable kind of beauty.